It started with an innocent curiosity that turned into an unrelenting storm. My wife, Karen, and I had been married for 12 years. We built a life together, filled with shared laughter, family vacations, and a beautiful daughter named Ella. At least, that's what I believed. Ella had just turned 10 when the whispers of doubt began to creep into my mind. She was beautiful, no doubt about it, with her mother's striking blue eyes and golden curls. But there was something about her features, her mannerisms, that didn't quite fit. Friends and relatives would occasionally comment on how little Ella resembled me, but I always shrugged it off. "She takes after Karen's side," I'd reply, dismissing the knot tightening in my stomach. Then came the science fair incident. Ella's project was about genetics, a simple experiment comparing inherited traits among family members. She needed a cheek swab from both Karen and me. At the time, I didn't think much of it. I was proud of my little scientist, and gave my sample willingly. A week later, Ella brought home her results. We gathered around the dining table, her colorful display board proudly showcasing her work. Karen beamed, capturing every moment on her phone. "And here's where I compared eye color genes," Ella said enthusiastically, pointing to a chart. "Mom's and mine matched perfectly." Karen clapped, her pride evident. "That's wonderful, sweetheart." "And Dad?" Ella hesitated, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. "It didn't really match." Her words hung in the air, a quiet bomb that detonated in my mind. Karen's smile faltered, and she reached for Ella's arm. "It's just a school project," Karen said, laughing nervously. "Sometimes these things don't align perfectly, right?" Ella nodded, but I couldn't ignore the sharp look Karen gave me. It was a fleeting moment, but enough to ignite the ember of doubt already smoldering in my chest. That night, as Karen slept soundly beside me, I couldn't shake the unease. What if this wasn't just a school project error? What if it meant something more? My thoughts spiraled, feeding off years of suppressed doubts and inconsistencies. Karen's frequent, girl trips, over the years resurfaced in my memory. How she'd come back with a renewed energy, a spark in her eyes that seemed oddly misplaced. And the way she'd often brush off questions about certain colleagues or friends. They'd seemed innocent at the time, but now? Now they felt like puzzle pieces waiting to fit into a picture I wasn't ready to see. The next morning, I left early under the pretense of a meeting and went straight to a lab downtown. I had a plan, a way to confirm or disprove my suspicions without involving anyone else. I handed over the cheek swabs I'd taken from Ella's science kit, as well as one I'd secretly collected from myself. The lab technician assured me the results would be ready in 3 to 5 business days. Each of those days felt like a year. Every moment I spent around Karen and Ella was an act, my mind torn between guilt and dread. What if I was wrong? What if the test came back proving Ella was my daughter, and I had doubted my wife for nothing? Or worse, what if I was right? On the 5th day, the results came in. The email's subject line stared at me like an accusation. "Genetic analysis results, confidential." I opened it, my heart pounding. And there it was. A simple, sterile sentence that shattered my world. The analysis indicates no paternal genetic match. My hands trembled as I read it again and again, hoping the words would change. But they didn't. They couldn't. Ella wasn't my daughter. I sat there for hours, staring blankly at the screen. Memories flooded back, each one warped now by this cruel truth. Every bedtime story, every scraped knee, every whispered, "I love you, Daddy." They were real for me, but for Karen? I wasn't ready to confront her yet. I needed answers, proof beyond this cold, clinical report. I needed to know the why. And I knew exactly where to start. After the results, my emotions alternated between heartbreak and fury. I stared at the computer screen, the damning confirmation blinking back at me. Ella wasn't mine. But who was? And how long had Karen been keeping this from me? I needed answers. But I wasn't ready to confront Karen yet, not without evidence. My first step was to dig deeper into her past, into moments that now seemed to carry a hidden weight. That evening, I sat at the dinner table, watching Karen and Ella laugh about some story from school. It felt surreal, like I was outside my own life, watching a family I no longer recognized. Karen was as cheerful as ever, but now her smile felt hollow, her laughter forced. Or maybe that was just my newfound suspicion coloring everything she did. "I've got a late meeting tomorrow," I said casually, breaking into their conversation. "Don't wait up for me." Karen glanced at me, her smile not faltering but her eyes narrowing slightly. "Everything okay at work?" "Yeah, just busy," I replied, already mentally crafting my excuse to leave the house unnoticed. She nodded, seemingly satisfied, and went back to chatting with Ella. The next day, I called a private investigator. Jake Wilkes was a former police officer who came highly recommended. When I met him at his small office downtown, his demeanor was professional, his handshake firm. "What can I do for you, Mr. Davis?" he asked, motioning for me to take a seat. I hesitated. Saying the words out loud felt like admitting to the collapse of my entire life. "I need to know if my wife has been unfaithful," I said finally, my voice low. Jake's expression didn't change. This wasn't his first rodeo. "Do you have any specific suspicions, or is this just a gut feeling?" I slid the lab results across the table. "This confirmed that my daughter isn't biologically mine. I don't know who her father is, or if there's been anything ongoing, but I need to find out." Jake nodded, glancing over the paper before setting it aside. "That's a heavy thing to discover. I'll start by looking into her current activities. Do you have any recent incidents or patterns that seem suspicious?" I thought back to Karen's frequent trips for work conferences over the years. Her increasing protectiveness over her phone. The way she'd seemed distant lately, though I'd chalked it up to normal marital ups and downs. "She travels a lot for work," I said. "And she's been more secretive lately, about her phone, her schedule. I also remember a time, years ago, when she got close to a coworker named Greg. She claimed it was just friendship, but now I'm not so sure." Jake took notes, his pen scratching across the notepad. "I'll start with her travel records and look into Greg. If there's anything there, I'll find it." I left Jake's office with a strange mixture of hope and dread. I wanted to know the truth, but I was terrified of what it might reveal. The following week felt like an eternity. I maintained my usual routine, even as I was crumbling inside. Karen seemed oblivious, or maybe she was just a better actor than I'd given her credit for. Every time she kissed me goodbye or texted me a quick "love you," I felt a pang of bitterness. Jake called me on Friday afternoon. "We need to meet," he said simply. That evening, I found myself back in Jake's office, my stomach in knots. He gestured for me to sit, his face serious. "I've got some initial findings," he began. "Your wife's recent travel matches up with the dates she provided you. She did attend conferences, but her activities afterward are concerning." He slid a manila folder across the desk. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were photos, grainy but clear enough. Karen sitting at a bar with a man I didn't recognize. Karen and the same man walking into a hotel together. The timestamps on the photos lined up with her most recent trip. I stared at the images, my throat dry. "Who is he?" I managed to ask. "His name's Eric McAllister," Jake said. "He's a consultant in the same field as your wife. They've crossed paths at multiple conferences over the years. It seems their relationship goes back a while." "How far back?" My voice cracked despite my best efforts to stay composed. Jake hesitated before answering. "My team hasn't confirmed the exact timeline, but it looks like they first connected about a decade ago." A decade. That was right around the time Ella was born. My mind reeled, connecting the dots in ways I didn't want to. "What else do you have on him?" I asked, my tone sharp. "McAllister's married," Jake said. "No kids. He's been traveling heavily for work, which might explain how he's managed to keep his own wife in the dark. We're still digging into his background." I closed the folder, my anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Karen's betrayal wasn't just a one-time mistake, it was a years-long deception. And the thought of Ella being tied to this man, this stranger, made my blood boil. I need more, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. I need to know everything, how far this goes, who else might know, and if there's anything else she's hiding. Jake nodded. We'll keep digging. Just be ready for whatever we find. As I left his office, clutching the folder tightly, I realized there was no turning back now. The cracks in my marriage weren't just cracks, they were chasms. And I was about to uncover just how deep they ran. I spent the weekend walking through a fog of disbelief and anger. Every word Karen spoke seemed laced with hidden meanings, every glance a veiled secret. My mind replayed the images from Jake's folder endlessly, torturing me with their stark clarity. Karen and that man, Eric, smiling, leaning close, walking into a hotel as if it was the most natural thing in the world. I tried to act normal, though normal felt like a foreign concept. Karen noticed my unease but attributed it to work stress, offering casual affection that only deepened the betrayal festering in my chest. By Monday, I knew I couldn't let this lie any longer. Jake's updates had come in over the weekend, providing more damning evidence, emails between Karen and Eric that were anything but professional, receipts for joint dinners and hotel stays dating back years, even a photo of Eric at a park with Ella when she was a toddler. The sheer length and depth of the affair made it clear this wasn't just some fling. This was a parallel life Karen had been living right under my nose. That evening, as Karen cooked dinner and Ella worked on her homework, I felt like an intruder in my own home. I watched Karen move through the kitchen, her face serene, humming a soft tune. It was almost enough to make me doubt myself, to question whether I should confront her or keep digging for even more proof. But then I remembered Jake's words, be ready for whatever we find. I wasn't ready, but I couldn't wait any longer. Karen, I said, my voice steady but firm. We need to talk. She turned, a smile on her face. Sure, Han, what's up? In private, I added, glancing toward Ella, who was busy scribbling on a worksheet. Karen's smile faltered slightly, but she nodded, wiping her hands on a towel. We stepped into the den, where I closed the door behind us. Karen crossed her arms, her brow furrowing with concern. You're scaring me, Liam. What's going on? I pulled the manila folder from my bag, holding it out to her. This is going on. Her eyes flicked to the folder, then back to me. She hesitated before taking it, her hands trembling slightly. What is this? She asked, her voice tight. Open it, I said, stepping back to watch her reaction. Karen opened the folder, her eyes scanning the first few pages. Her face paled as she reached the photos. She closed the folder quickly, clutching it to her chest like a shield. Where did you get this? She whispered. That doesn't matter, I said. What matters is that you've been lying to me. For years. Karen's mouth opened, then closed. She glanced toward the door as if considering an escape, but there was nowhere to run. She set the folder down on the coffee table, her hands trembling. It's not what it looks like, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. Don't insult me, I snapped. I have photos, emails, receipts. I know about Eric. I know about the hotel stays, the dinners, and God knows what else. I know he's Ella's biological father. Karen flinched as if I'd slapped her. Tears filled her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. How long? I demanded. How long have you been doing this behind my back? She sank onto the couch, her hands covering her face. I don't know, she said weakly. It wasn't supposed to be like this. I laughed bitterly. Oh, it wasn't supposed to be like this? How was it supposed to be, Karen? You were going to keep stringing me along while you played house with him? She shook her head. It wasn't like that. Eric and I, we had a connection, but it wasn't serious at first. It got out of hand. Out of hand? I repeated, my voice rising. You had a child with him, Karen. You let me believe she was mine for 10 years. 10 years! How do you justify that? Karen sobbed into her hands, her words muffled. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. And then Ella came along, and I saw how much you loved her. I thought it didn't matter. You thought wrong, I said coldly. You stole a decade of my life, Karen. A decade I spent loving a child that wasn't mine, building a life with someone who was lying to me every step of the way. Karen looked up at me, her eyes red and pleading. Liam, please. I never meant to hurt you. I made a mistake, but I love you. I love our family. Can't we fix this? Fix this? I barked out a bitter laugh. You think we can fix this? You've been living a double life, Karen. You've been lying to me, to Ella, to everyone. And now you want to just brush it under the rug? She reached for me, but I stepped back, her touch now unbearable. Don't, I said. I need time to think. To decide if there's even anything left to save. Karen collapsed onto the couch, sobbing uncontrollably. I turned and left the room, the sound of her cries following me like a ghost. I spent the night in the guest room, staring at the ceiling as the weight of everything pressed down on me. Karen's tears hadn't moved me. Her excuses had only fueled my anger. The thought of Ella, though, brought a new wave of pain. She was innocent in all this, but her entire world was about to crumble. In the morning, I called Jake again. I need you to dig deeper, I said. I need to know everything about Eric McAllister. His life, his family, his connection to Karen, everything. Jake hesitated. Are you sure? You've already got a lot. I'm sure, I said firmly. I need to know what I'm dealing with before I make my next move. And with that, the next chapter of my life began, a chapter built on uncovering the lies beneath the surface and deciding how to rebuild from the ruins. Jake's updates came faster than I'd expected. By Wednesday, he'd compiled a detailed dossier on Eric McAllister. Each piece of information painted a clearer picture of the man who had infiltrated my life, whether intentionally or not. Eric was a senior consultant at a prestigious firm, well regarded in his industry for his sharp mind and charisma. Married for over a decade, his wife, Danielle, ran a successful bakery in the suburbs. They had no children. At least, none that they acknowledged. Jake uncovered emails between Karen and Eric dating back 11 years, months before Ella's birth. They were careful in their exchanges, avoiding any overt declarations of love, but the subtext was unmistakable. The tone shifted over the years from infatuation to what could only be described as calculated intimacy. They had clearly mastered the art of living two lives. Eric's financial records revealed a history of suspiciously timed expenses, hotel stays coinciding with Karen's conferences, lavish dinners at high-end restaurants, and even jewelry purchases. It was a breadcrumb trail of betrayal stretching back farther than I could bear to think about. That evening, after putting Ella to bed, I poured myself a stiff drink and sat in the darkened living room. Karen approached cautiously, her steps hesitant. She'd been walking on eggshells since our confrontation, and I relished the fear in her eyes. It felt like the only power I had left in this nightmare. Liam, she said softly, breaking the silence. Can we talk? I swirled the amber liquid in my glass, staring at the way it caught the faint glow of the table lamp. Talk about what? I said, my voice cold. How you destroyed our marriage? How you let me believe a lie for 10 years? Karen flinched, her arms wrapping around herself. I know you're angry. You have every right to be. But we need to figure out how to move forward, for Ella's sake. For Ella's sake? I snapped, standing abruptly. Don't you dare use her to justify your actions. You didn't think about her when you were sneaking around with Eric. You didn't think about me either. So don't act like you suddenly care about moving forward. Tears welled in her eyes, but I wasn't moved. I care about her, Liam. I care about you. This has been eating me alive for years. I leaned in, my voice a low growl. Not enough to stop, though, was it? Not enough to tell me the truth. You only cared about yourself, Karen. You wanted to have your cake and eat it too. Karen's tears spilled over, her hands trembling. I don't know how to fix this, she admitted. But I don't want to lose our family. Please, Liam, tell me what to do. I stared at her for a long moment, my chest heaving with the effort of holding myself together. It's not that simple, Karen. I don't know if this is fixable. And even if it is, I'm not sure I want to. Her sobs filled the room as I stormed out, leaving her to drown in the mess she'd created. The following morning, Jake called with a bombshell. Liam, you're not going to believe this, he said, his tone unusually grim. I found something in Eric's financial records. He's been transferring money monthly into a trust account. Why does that matter? I asked, already dreading the answer. The account is in Ella's name, Jake said. It's been active since she was born. My grip tightened on the phone. You're saying he's been funding her this whole time? Does Karen know about this? I can't say for sure, but my guess is yes. It's too calculated for her to be completely in the dark. If she didn't know in the beginning, she definitely does now. The weight of this revelation hit me like a freight train. It wasn't just that Karen had lied to me. It was that Eric had been playing a silent role in my daughter's life all along. Funding her. Possibly planning for a future where he could claim her as his own. Do you want me to keep digging? Jake asked after a long pause. Yes, I said through gritted teeth. I want to know everything. Where that money is going, how much Karen knew, and if there's anything else they're hiding. Jake agreed, and I ended the call, my mind racing. If Karen had been complicit in this, if she'd accepted money from Eric while letting me believe Ella was mine, there was no coming back from it. That evening, I confronted Karen with the new information. She was in the kitchen, preparing dinner as if our lives hadn't been torn apart. Who's paying for Ella's trust fund? I asked, my voice cutting through the domestic quiet. Karen froze, the knife in her hand hovering over a cutting board. Slowly, she turned to face me, her face pale. What are you talking about? She asked, feigning confusion. Don't play dumb, Karen. I know about the monthly deposits. I know they're coming from Eric. So tell me, did you know about it? Her silence was answer enough. You knew, I said, my voice shaking with rage. You knew he was sending money for her, and you didn't tell me. Karen's eyes filled with tears. I didn't know how to tell you, she said, her voice trembling. I didn't want to lose you. I didn't want to hurt you. Well, congratulations, I spat. You've managed to do both. I stormed out of the kitchen, leaving Karen sobbing in my wake. My mind was made up. There was no salvaging this. The lies ran too deep, the betrayal too complete. Tomorrow, I would meet with a lawyer. And for the first time in 10 years, I would start building a life without Karen. The next morning, I woke up with a single goal, to take the first steps toward freeing myself from the tangled mess Karen had created. The betrayal had settled into a dull ache, but I wasn't going to let it paralyze me. I was done being blindsided, done being a passive participant in my own life. After dropping Ella off at school, I drove downtown to meet with a divorce attorney. The office was sleek, its modern decor giving off a no-nonsense vibe. A receptionist led me to a private room, where I met Allison Green, a sharp-eyed woman who looked like she'd won more battles than she'd lost. Mr. Davis, she said, extending a hand. Tell me what's going on. I hesitated, trying to organize the chaos in my head. It's a long story, I began. But to put it simply, my wife has been having an affair for over a decade. The man she's been seeing is the biological father of my daughter. Allison didn't flinch. This wasn't her first case involving infidelity. Do you have evidence? She asked. I do, I said, handing over the folder Jake had compiled. Emails, photos, financial records. Everything. She flipped through the folder, her expression growing more serious with each page. When she finished, she closed the folder and looked at me. You've got a strong case for divorce. Our state is no fault, so the court won't punish her for the affair directly, but the financial aspect, especially the trust fund, could work in your favor. Are you looking for full custody of Ella? Her question hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't thought that far ahead. Could I fight for custody, knowing Ella wasn't biologically mine? Would I even have the legal right to try? I don't know, I admitted. Ella doesn't know the truth yet. She still thinks I'm her father. I don't want to hurt her, but I can't pretend everything's fine. Allison nodded, her tone softening. It's a tough situation. You might want to speak with a family therapist before making any big decisions. They can help you navigate how to handle this with your daughter. I'll think about it, I said. Right now, I just want to protect myself. Karen's been lying to me for years. I can't trust her. We'll start by filing for divorce, Allison said. We'll request financial disclosures from her and Eric. If she's been receiving money from him for Ella, we'll make sure that's accounted for. I'll also flag the trust fund for review. Are you prepared for this to get messy? I nodded. Messy's the only thing I'm prepared for at this point. When I returned home, Karen was waiting for me in the living room. She looked like she hadn't slept, her eyes puffy and red. We need to talk, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. We've done enough talking, I said, brushing past her. Liam, please, she said, grabbing my arm. I need you to hear me out. I turned to face her, my patience threadbare. Fine. Talk. Karen wrung her hands, her eyes darting around the room as if looking for the right words. I know I've hurt you. And I know there's nothing I can say to fix that. But I need you to understand, I never wanted to destroy our family. You did a pretty good job of it anyway, I said coldly. Her shoulders sagged. I made mistakes. I let things get out of control. But I love you, Liam. I love Ella. I don't want to lose what we have. What we have? I said, my voice rising. Karen, what we had was built on lies. You had an affair for over 10 years. You let me believe Ella was my daughter while taking money from her real father behind my back. How do you expect me to move past that? I didn't want to hurt you, she said again, tears streaming down her face. I was scared, Liam. Scared of losing you, of losing everything we built. You should have thought about that before you started sleeping with Eric, I said, the venom in my voice surprising even me. You made your choices, Karen. And now we're both living with the consequences. Karen sank onto the couch, her sobs filling the room. I didn't feel sorry for her. My sympathy had been exhausted. I left her there and went upstairs, locking myself in the guest room. Later that night, I received a call from Jake. I've got something you'll want to see, he said. Can you meet me in the morning? What is it? I asked, my heart sinking. I found out where some of Eric's money has been going, Jake said. It's bigger than we thought. I agreed to meet him first thing. As I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath me was about to give way yet again. The next morning, Jake laid out his latest findings. Eric's been funneling money not just into Ella's trust fund but also into offshore accounts tied to Karen, he said. It looks like he's been planning for something long-term, possibly a future where they're together. The words hit me like a brick. Karen wasn't just a victim of her own bad decisions, she was an active participant in this deception, possibly planning an escape route with Eric all along. What do you want to do with this information? Jake asked. I stared at the documents, my mind racing. I could use this against Karen in the divorce, but the revelation about the offshore accounts felt like a betrayal on another level. Keep digging, I said finally. I want to know everything. No more surprises. As I drove home, I thought about Ella. How would I protect her from the fallout of all this? How would I tell her the truth without shattering her world? And could I ever look at her the same way, knowing she wasn't mine? The answers wouldn't come easily. But one thing was certain, I wasn't done fighting. Not for my dignity, not for my daughter, and not for the life Karen had stolen from me piece by piece. The information Jake had uncovered about Eric's secret offshore accounts kept me awake that night. My thoughts churned relentlessly as I considered the implications. Karen and Eric hadn't just shared an affair, they had built a financial safety net, a betrayal that cut deeper than I'd imagined. If Karen was planning an escape route with Eric, where did that leave me? Or Ella? The next morning, Karen's attempts at normalcy grated on my nerves. She moved around the kitchen, making breakfast as though we were still the happy couple she'd pretended we were for years. I couldn't stomach the sight of her. "Stop," I said abruptly, my voice harsh. "You don't get to act like everything's fine." Karen froze, the spatula in her hand trembling. "Liam," she began, her voice soft. "We have to find a way through this, for Ella's sake." I laughed bitterly. "You don't get to invoke Ella. You've been lying to her as much as you've been lying to me." Her face crumpled. "I love her," she said. "She's my daughter." "She's my daughter too," I snapped. "At least, that's what I thought for 10 years. Karen's lip quivered, but she said nothing. The silence between us was deafening, a chasm neither of us could cross. Finally, she placed the spatula down and left the kitchen, her shoulders slumped in defeat. That afternoon, I met with Allison Green again. I handed her the latest information from Jake, detailing Eric's offshore accounts and Karen's involvement. "This changes things," Allison said, flipping through the papers. "If Karen's been funneling money without your knowledge, it could work in your favor during the divorce proceedings." "How so?" I asked, my voice laced with exhaustion. "For one, it establishes financial deceit, which the court takes seriously. We can argue that she's been mismanaging marital assets, even if the funds originated from Eric. Second, it gives us leverage. If she wants to avoid legal exposure, she may be more inclined to settle quickly and favorably." I nodded, though the thought of leveraging Karen's betrayal didn't bring me the satisfaction I'd expected. "What about custody?" I asked, my voice quieter now. "What are my chances of keeping Ella?" Allison sighed. "That's tricky. You're on Ella's birth certificate, so legally you're her father. But if Karen, or Eric, decides to challenge that, things could get complicated." "Have you told Ella yet?" "No," I admitted. "I don't know how." "You'll need to," Allison said gently. "It's better she hears it from you than someone else. And if you want to fight for custody, the court will want to know that you're committed to being honest with her." Honest. The word felt like a mockery after everything Karen had done. When I got home, Ella was in her room, humming as she colored at her desk. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her for a moment. She looked so much like Karen it hurt. "Hey, kiddo," I said, stepping inside. "Hi, Dad," she chirped, flashing me a bright smile. She set down her crayons and turned to face me. "What's up?" I sat on the edge of her bed, my heart heavy. "There's something I need to talk to you about," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. Her smile faded, replaced by a curious frown. "Is something wrong?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. How do you tell a child that the foundation of her life is a lie? That the father she's always known might not be her father at all? "I love you, Ella," I began. "No matter what happens, that will never change. You know that, right?" She nodded slowly, her frown deepening. "I love you too, Dad. But you're scaring me." I took a deep breath, bracing myself. "Sometimes, grown-ups make mistakes. And sometimes those mistakes affect the people they love. Your mom and we've been dealing with some things." Ella's eyes widened, fear creeping into her expression. "Are you getting divorced?" I swallowed hard. "We might be. But that doesn't change how much we both love you." She looked down at her hands, her small fingers twisting nervously. "Is that why you've been fighting?" "Yes," I admitted. "But there's something else I need to tell you. Something about your mom, and me." Ella's gaze snapped up to meet mine, her blue eyes wide and filled with confusion. "What is it?" I couldn't do it. Not yet. The words stuck in my throat, the weight of them too heavy to bear. Instead, I reached for her hand, holding it tightly. "Just remember that I'll always be here for you," I said. "No matter what." Ella nodded, her face troubled but trusting. "Okay, Dad." I left her room feeling like a coward, knowing I'd only delayed the inevitable. That night, as Karen and I sat in the living room in tense silence, I broke the stalemate. We need to tell Ella the truth, I said. Karen looked at me, panic flashing in her eyes. No, she said firmly. She's just a child. She doesn't need to know. She has a right to know, I countered. The longer we keep this from her, the worse it will be when she finds out. Karen shook her head, tears spilling down her cheeks. You don't understand, Liam. This will destroy her. It's already destroying me, I said coldly. And it will destroy her even more if she finds out from someone else. Karen buried her face in her hands, her sobs muffled. Please, she whispered. Not yet. Give me time to figure this out. You had 10 years, I said, my voice sharp. Time's up. I left her there, retreating to the guest room with a renewed resolve. The truth was coming, whether Karen was ready for it or not. And once it did, there would be no turning back. The next morning dawned gray and cold, a fitting backdrop to the storm brewing inside my home. Karen avoided me as she prepared Ella's breakfast, her movements stiff and robotic. Ella, blissfully unaware, chattered about a school project she was excited about. I envied her innocence, even as I dreaded the moment it would shatter. As Karen left to drop Ella off at school, I sat at the kitchen table, staring at the divorce papers Allison had sent over for my review. They were a stark reminder of how irreparable things had become. I couldn't bring myself to sign them yet, not until I told Ella the truth and ensured she knew where I stood. By mid-morning, Jake called with another update. I've been looking into Eric's personal life more closely, he said. You're not going to like this. What now? I asked, bracing myself. Eric's been corresponding with an attorney specializing in custody cases, Jake said. It seems like he's preparing to assert paternity over Ella. The words hit me like a freight train. He's what? Jake sighed. It's not confirmed yet, but all signs point to him wanting to step into Ella's life formally. He hasn't filed anything, but it's only a matter of time. I clenched my jaw, my grip tightening on the phone. He's not taking her from me. You need to act fast, Jake warned. Talk to your lawyer. Make sure you're ahead of this. I will, I said, ending the call. That evening, I waited for Karen to return from work. When she walked through the door, she looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn. I didn't care. We need to talk, I said sharply. Karen flinched at my tone but nodded, setting her purse down. What is it now? Eric's planning to assert paternity over Ella, I said without preamble. He's been in contact with a custody attorney. Her face crumpled, and she sank onto the couch. Oh God, she whispered. I didn't know he'd take it this far. You knew he was sending money, I shot back. You knew he was involved in ways I didn't. How could you not see this coming? I thought I could keep him at a distance, Karen said, her voice breaking. I thought he'd be content with just supporting her financially. Well, you thought wrong, I said coldly. And now he's going to try to take her. I won't let that happen. Karen looked up at me, tears streaming down her face. What are you going to do? I've already contacted my lawyer, I said. I'm fighting this. And if you don't stand with me, I'll make sure the court knows exactly what you've done. Her sobs deepened, but I felt no sympathy. She'd brought this on herself, and now we were all paying the price. The next day, I met with Allison to discuss the custody situation. She listened intently as I explained Jake's findings, her pen flying across her notepad. This complicates things, she said finally. If Eric can prove paternity and argues that he has a right to be part of Ella's life, the court might side with him, especially if Karen supports his claim. She won't, I said firmly. I'll make sure of it. You'll need to prepare for a fight, Allison warned. Custody battles are messy, and if Eric pushes for shared custody or visitation, it could get ugly. I'm ready, I said, though the words felt hollow. The thought of losing even a fraction of time with Ella was unbearable. That evening, I finally found the courage to sit down with Ella and tell her the truth. Karen sat beside me on the couch, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Ella looked between us, her wide blue eyes filled with concern. Is this about the divorce? She asked quietly. In a way, I said. But it's more than that. I took a deep breath, my heart pounding. Ella, you know I love you, right? More than anything in the world. She nodded, her brow furrowing. I love you too, Dad. What's going on? There's something we need to tell you, I said, glancing at Karen. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Something about your family. Ella tilted her head, confusion clouding her face. What do you mean? The man you know as your dad, Karen began, her voice trembling. Isn't your biological father. Ella froze, her eyes wide. What? She whispered, her voice barely audible. I reached for her hand, but she pulled away, her expression a mix of shock and betrayal. What do you mean he's not my dad? Ella, I said gently. I've always been your dad in every way that matters. But biologically, there's someone else. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No. That's not true. I wish it weren't, I said, my voice cracking. But it is. And I want you to know that it doesn't change how much I love you. You're my daughter no matter what. Ella turned to Karen, her face twisted in anger. You lied to me, she said, her voice rising. You both lied to me. Karen sobbed, reaching for her, but Ella recoiled. I hate you, she screamed, running upstairs and slamming her bedroom door. Karen collapsed onto the couch, her sobs filling the room. I sat beside her in silence, my heart breaking all over again. That night, as I lay awake in the guest room, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my mind. Ella's tears, her anger, her pain, it was all my fault, even if I wasn't the one who started this mess. But I knew one thing for sure, no matter what it took, I would fight for her. I wouldn't let Eric, or anyone else, take my daughter away from me. Ella refused to speak to us for days. Every attempt to reach out was met with slammed doors and tear-streaked silences. Karen seemed paralyzed by guilt, retreating into herself as the weight of her choices bore down on her. For the first time in years, I saw her not as the confident woman who had deceived me but as someone lost in her own mess, unable to find a way out. But I had no time for pity. My focus was on Ella. One evening, as Karen sat staring blankly at her untouched dinner, I decided to take a more direct approach. I knocked softly on Ella's door, waiting for the familiar, "Go away," that never came. Instead, the door creaked open, revealing my daughter sitting cross-legged on her bed, clutching a stuffed animal she hadn't touched in years. "Hey," I said gently, stepping inside. She didn't look at me, her gaze fixed on the frayed ear of the stuffed bunny in her hands. "What do you want?" she mumbled. "I just want to talk," I said, sitting on the edge of her bed. "I know you're upset, and you have every right to be. But I need you to know how much I love you." Ella's grip on the stuffed bunny tightened, but she didn't respond. "I didn't know the truth until recently," I continued. "Your mom kept it from me, too. But finding out doesn't change how I feel about you. You're my daughter, Ella. You always will be." She sniffled, her voice trembling as she spoke. "Why did she lie? Why didn't she tell me?" I hesitated, choosing my words carefully. "Sometimes people make decisions out of fear. I think your mom was scared of losing us, of breaking our family. But that doesn't make it right." Ella finally looked up at me, her blue eyes filled with tears. "Am I supposed to love him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "The other guy?" My chest tightened at her question. "That's up to you," I said softly. "But you don't have to feel anything for him you're not ready to. He's not the one who's been there for you all these years. I have." Ella's lip quivered, and she launched herself into my arms, sobbing against my chest. I held her tightly, my own tears falling as I whispered, "I've got you, kiddo. No matter what." That moment was a small victory, but I knew the battle wasn't over. Eric's intentions loomed like a dark cloud, and I had no doubt he'd make his moves soon. Jake's updates only confirmed my fears. He's been meeting with his attorney regularly. Jake told me during our next call. It looks like he's gearing up to file for some form of custody or visitation. How strong is his case? I asked, dread pooling in my stomach. Paternity gives him a legal foothold, but it's not a slam dunk, Jake said. Courts prioritize the child's best interest, and you've been Ella's father her entire life. That counts for a lot. Do you think Karen will side with him? I asked, the thought sending a fresh wave of anger through me. She'd be a fool to, Jake said. But you should prepare for anything. Karen and I sat down that evening for a conversation I dreaded but knew was necessary. She looked wary as I joined her in the living room, clutching her mug of tea like a lifeline. I spoke to Jake. I began. Eric's planning to go after custody. Karen's face fell, her eyes filling with tears. I had no idea he would take it this far, she said, her voice trembling. That doesn't matter now, I said. What matters is what you're going to do about it. Are you going to support me, or are you going to let him walk into Ella's life like he belongs there? Karen stared at me, her expression conflicted. I don't want to hurt her any more than she already is, she said. But Eric is her biological father. Doesn't he have a right to know her? Does she have a right to be ripped apart by this even more than she already has been? I shot back. She doesn't know him, Karen. She doesn't want to know him. And you're the one who made sure of that for the past 10 years. Karen flinched at my words, guilt etched across her face. I didn't know how to handle it. She whispered. I was scared. Well, now you have to, I said firmly. You have to choose. Because if you don't stand with me, I'll fight him alone. But don't expect me to forgive you for it. Her tears spilled over, but I didn't soften. I couldn't. Ella's future was at stake. The next day, my lawyer filed a motion to establish myself as Ella's legal father, despite the lack of a biological connection. It was a risky move, but Allison assured me it was the best way to protect my position. If Eric wanted to fight for paternity, he'd have to go through me first. That evening, Ella came to me with a question that stopped me cold. What happens if he wins? She asked, her voice small. I knelt in front of her, meeting her tearful gaze. He won't, I said firmly. I'll make sure of it. But what if he does? She pressed. Then we'll figure it out together, I said, pulling her into a hug. No matter what happens, we'll face it together. As I held her, I made a silent vow. I would protect Ella from Eric's intrusion, from Karen's mistakes, and from the fallout of a life she never asked for. Whatever it took, I would keep her safe. Eric made his move faster than I'd anticipated. A week after my lawyer filed the motion to solidify my legal paternity over Ella, I received a summons to appear in court. Eric was officially petitioning for custody rights, citing his biological connection to Ella and Karen's apparent cooperation over the years. The audacity of his claim made my blood boil. He had been in the shadows all this time, funding a trust in secret, while I had been the one raising Ella. Now he wanted to step in and play the hero? Not on my watch. Karen's reaction to the summons was telling. She was pale and shaky as she sat at the kitchen table, the document trembling in her hands. He's really doing it, she whispered. I didn't think he'd go through with it. You didn't think a lot of things, Karen, I said coldly. And now look where we are. She flinched at my tone, but I didn't care. What are you going to do? She asked, her voice barely audible. I'm going to fight, I said. And you're going to decide whose side you're on. Her tearful gaze met mine. You know I want what's best for Ella. Do you? I asked, my voice rising. Because every decision you've made up until now says otherwise. Karen's tears fell freely, but I was done offering her comfort. I left her sitting there, her shoulders slumped in defeat, and called Allison to discuss the next steps. The first court hearing was a tense affair. Eric was there, dressed sharply in a tailored suit, exuding confidence. Karen sat beside me, her head bowed, while Allison explained our case to the judge. We argued that I had been Ella's father in every meaningful way, that I had provided for her emotionally and financially since the day she was born. We painted Eric as an absentee parent who had no prior relationship with Ella. Eric's lawyer countered with the biological connection, claiming that he had been kept out of Ella's life by circumstances beyond his control. They presented evidence of the trust fund he'd set up, attempting to portray him as a caring and responsible father. The judge decided there was enough complexity in the case to warrant further hearings. In the meantime, Eric was granted supervised visitation rights, a small victory for him, but one that felt like a devastating loss to me. Ella's reaction to the visitation order was heartbreaking. When I told her about it, her face crumpled, and tears spilled down her cheeks. "I don't want to see him," she cried. "I don't even know him." "I know, sweetheart," I said, pulling her into a hug. "But it's just for a little while. I'll be there the whole time. You don't have to do this alone." She clung to me, her small body trembling. "Why can't it just be us?" she asked through her sobs. I didn't have an answer for her. All I could do was hold her and promise to protect her as best I could. The first visitation took place at a neutral location, a sterile room at a family services center, supervised by a court-appointed monitor. Ella sat stiffly beside me, her eyes wide with fear as Eric walked in. He smiled warmly, trying to appear non-threatening, but Ella leaned closer to me, her grip on my hand tightening. "Hi, Ella," Eric said, his voice soft. "I've heard so much about you." Ella didn't respond. She buried her face in my arm, refusing to look at him. Eric's smile faltered, but he pressed on, pulling out a small gift, a stuffed bear with a heart stitched on its chest. "I brought you something," he said, placing it on the table. Ella didn't move, and I resisted the urge to tell him to take his bear and leave. This wasn't about me, it was about Ella. And she was making it clear she wanted no part of this. The visit lasted an agonizing hour, during which Eric tried repeatedly to engage Ella in conversation. She remained silent, her face buried in my arm the entire time. When it was finally over, she bolted from the room the moment we were given the all-clear. Back in the car, Ella exploded. "Why do I have to see him?" she yelled, her face red with anger. "I don't want to. He's not my dad!" Her words were like a knife to my heart, cutting through the layers of pain and frustration. "I know, sweetheart," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "But the court says we have to. For now." "It's not fair!" she cried. "You're my dad. You've always been my dad." I pulled over, unable to drive through the tears welling in my eyes. Turning to face her, I held her hands tightly. "Ella, I am your dad. No one can take that away from us. Not Eric, not anyone. You and me, we're a team. Always." She threw her arms around my neck, clinging to me as if I were her lifeline. In that moment, I vowed once again to do whatever it took to protect her. As the custody battle dragged on, the strain began to take its toll. Karen and I barely spoke, our conversations reduced to terse exchanges about logistics. Ella withdrew further into herself, her once bright laughter now a rare occurrence. And Eric continued to push for more access, his confidence growing with each hearing. But I wasn't giving up. Ella was my daughter, no matter what the DNA said. And I would fight to keep her safe from the chaos that had upended our lives. The custody battle entered its most critical phase. The court-appointed psychologist conducted evaluations with everyone involved, me, Karen, Eric, and even Ella. It was a grueling process, each session dredging up painful emotions and forcing us to confront truths we tried to bury. For Ella, it was particularly hard. She didn't understand why she had to repeatedly explain that she didn't want to see Eric, or why the adults in her life couldn't just leave her alone. The psychologist's findings would play a significant role in the judge's final decision, and the weight of that knowledge hung heavily over me. Eric's confidence remained unshaken. At the next hearing, his lawyer argued that Eric's financial contributions through the trust fund demonstrated his commitment to Ella's well-being. They portrayed him as a victim of circumstance, kept from his daughter by Karen's decisions and my ignorance. Eric sat there with a calm, calculated demeanor, as if he'd already won. Allison countered brilliantly. She painted me as the steady, present father who had been there for every scraped knee, every school play, every bedtime story. Fatherhood, she said in her closing argument, is about more than biology. It's about love, consistency, and sacrifice. Liam Davis has been all those things for Ella. The court adjourned to deliberate, leaving us in a nerve-wracking limbo. I spent the next few days on edge, unable to focus on anything else. Even Karen seemed more subdued than usual, her guilt rendering her uncharacteristically quiet. Finally, the day of the ruling arrived. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Ella was not present, thankfully, but her future hung in the balance. The judge began with a summary of the case, detailing the complexities and emotions involved. My heart pounded as she turned her attention to the custody matter. In the interest of the child, the judge said, this court has determined that maintaining stability in her life is paramount. While Mr. McAllister has demonstrated a biological connection and financial contributions, his relationship with the child is limited at best. Therefore, full custody will remain with Mr. Davis, who has been her primary caregiver since birth. Relief flooded my body as the words sank in. Ella was staying with me. Eric's request for joint custody had been denied, though he was granted limited supervised visitation on a quarterly basis, a compromise I hated but could live with. Eric's face darkened, his confident facade cracking for the first time. Karen wiped tears from her eyes, though whether they were tears of relief or regret, I couldn't tell. The aftermath of the ruling was bittersweet. I had won the fight for Ella, but the scars of the battle lingered. My relationship with Karen was beyond repair. She had been supportive in court, but the damage she'd done to our family couldn't be undone. We finalized our divorce quietly, agreeing on terms that prioritized Ella's stability. Eric's quarterly visitations were a thorn I'd have to endure, but I vowed to make them as painless as possible for Ella. She didn't have to love him, but she needed to understand where she came from. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but one I took for her sake. At home, Ella and I began to rebuild. The laughter that had been absent for so long slowly returned. I worked hard to ensure she felt safe and loved, giving her the stability she craved. We went on weekend trips, explored new hobbies, and spent quiet evenings watching movies together. Slowly, the wounds began to heal. Karen moved into an apartment across town. She saw Ella regularly, though their relationship was strained. Ella's trust in her mother had been deeply shaken, and it would take time, if ever, for that trust to be restored. One evening, as Ella and I sat on the porch watching the sunset, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Dad," she said, "why did you fight so hard to keep me?" Her question caught me off guard, but I answered honestly. "Because you're my daughter," I said. "I don't care what anyone else says. You've always been my daughter, and you always will be." Ella smiled, her blue eyes shimmering in the fading light. "I'm glad you're my dad." I wrapped my arm around her, pulling her close. "Me too, kiddo." As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The fight was over, but the journey wasn't. Ella and I still had a long road ahead, but we were walking it together. Life after the court ruling took on a strange rhythm. There was no dramatic conclusion, no clean slate. Instead, it was a slow process of rebuilding, of finding our footing in a world that had been shaken to its core. Ella and I adjusted to a life that felt both familiar and foreign, like wearing an old pair of shoes that no longer quite fit. Karen's visits became a point of contention. Ella struggled to balance her love for her mother with the betrayal she still felt. Some days she would return from their visits quiet and withdrawn, while other days she seemed almost herself. I tried to stay neutral, encouraging Ella to maintain her relationship with Karen without pressuring her. Karen, for her part, appeared genuinely remorseful. She made an effort to respect boundaries, often reaching out to me with updates about her time with Ella or asking for advice on how to reconnect with her. But our conversations were strained, a reminder of how far we'd drifted. One evening, Karen showed up unannounced. I opened the door, surprised to see her standing there with a hesitant expression. "I didn't want to call," she said, her voice soft. "But I need to talk to you." I stepped aside, letting her in. She glanced around the house, her gaze lingering on the photos of Ella and me that now adorned the walls. "I'm trying," she said, sitting on the edge of the couch. "With Ella. But it's hard. She looks at me like I'm a stranger." "You're not a stranger," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "But it's going to take time. You have to give her that." Karen nodded, her eyes glistening. "I just wish I could go back. Undo everything." "We can't go back," I said, my voice firm. "But you can make better choices now. That's all you can do." Karen looked down, her hands clasped tightly. "Thank you," she said after a long silence, "for not turning her against me." "I'm not doing it for you," I said. "I'm doing it for Ella." She nodded again, her expression unreadable. After a few moments, she stood and walked to the door. "Good night, Liam," she said softly before leaving. Ella's quarterly visits with Eric were awkward and uncomfortable, but she endured them with a quiet strength that broke my heart. She rarely spoke about the visits afterward, and I didn't press her. I knew better than to push her into sharing more than she was ready to. One day, as we drove home from one of Eric's visits, she broke her silence. "Do I have to keep seeing him?" she asked, her voice small. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, my chest tightening at the sight of her downcast expression. "For now," I said. "The court says it's important." "But why?" she pressed. "He's not my dad." "You are." I pulled into our driveway and turned off the car, turning to face her. "I know it's hard, sweetheart. And I know it doesn't feel fair. But part of growing up is learning to deal with things that aren't fair. You don't have to love him, and you don't have to think of him as your dad. But you do have to see him, for now." Ella frowned, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I don't like him." "You don't have to like him," I said gently. "You just have to get through it. And I'll be right here with you, every step of the way." She nodded reluctantly, her small shoulders slumping in defeat. "Okay." As the months passed, life began to stabilize. Ella threw herself into school and extracurricular activities, her laughter becoming more frequent as she rediscovered her sense of joy. I encouraged her interests, attending every soccer game and school play, cheering her on with a renewed sense of purpose. For me, work became a welcome distraction. My colleagues had been supportive during the custody battle, and returning to a semblance of normalcy at the office felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. I even began reconnecting with old friends, allowing myself moments of levity that had been absent for far too long. One afternoon, as Ella and I walked home from the park, she slipped her hand into mine. "Dad?" she said, her voice thoughtful. "Yeah, kiddo? Do you think we'll ever be normal again?" I stopped, crouching down to meet her gaze. "I don't think we'll ever go back to the way things were," I said honestly. "But that doesn't mean we can't be happy. Normal isn't about what other people think, it's about what feels right for us." She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I like that." "Me too," I said, standing and squeezing her hand. "Come on. Let's go home." That night, as I tucked Ella into bed, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, I felt like we were on solid ground. The months following the custody battle brought a quiet reprieve. Life wasn't perfect, but the chaos had subsided into something manageable. Ella was thriving in school, and though her relationship with Karen was strained, they were slowly rebuilding their bond. Karen seemed to understand that trust wasn't something she could demand, it had to be earned, brick by painstaking brick. Eric, on the other hand, remained a looming shadow. His quarterly visitations continued, each one awkward and emotionally draining for Ella. She never spoke about them unless I asked, and even then, her answers were clipped and dismissive. "I'm fine, Dad," she'd say, but the tightness in her voice told a different story. One Sunday afternoon, Ella surprised me by walking into the living room with a question that stopped me in my tracks. Do I have to keep seeing him forever? She asked, her voice tentative. I set down the newspaper I'd been pretending to read and motioned for her to sit beside me. Why do you ask? I said, careful to keep my tone neutral. I just don't like it, she admitted, her hands twisting in her lap. It's weird. He tries too hard. And he doesn't feel like anything to me. I nodded, letting her words sink in. The court thinks it's important for you to have a relationship with him because he's your biological father, I said. But if you feel strongly about this, we can talk to your therapist about it. Maybe they can help us figure out what to do. Ella's face brightened slightly. You mean I don't have to decide by myself? Of course not, I said, wrapping an arm around her. You're not in this alone, Ella. We're a team, remember? She nodded, leaning into me. Thanks, Dad. Karen called that evening, asking to come over and talk. She had been making an effort to be more transparent, but I was wary of her motivations. Still, I agreed. Ella was in her room when Karen arrived, and I led her to the kitchen. What's on your mind? I asked, keeping my tone even. Karen hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee mug. I wanted to talk about Ella, she said. She mentioned she doesn't like seeing Eric. She told me the same thing, I said. I'm planning to bring it up with her therapist. Karen nodded, her expression thoughtful. Do you think we made a mistake agreeing to the visitation arrangement? I raised an eyebrow. You were the one who insisted he had a right to be part of her life. I know, she said softly. But I didn't realize how hard it would be for her. I thought it might help her understand where she came from. But maybe it's just confusing her more. She's not confused, Karen, I said firmly. She knows who her father is. And it's not Eric. Karen's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't argue. I just want to do what's right for her. Then follow her lead, I said. Listen to what she's telling us. At the next therapy session, Ella opened up more than I expected. Her therapist, a kind but no-nonsense woman named Dr. Meyer, gently guided the conversation. How do you feel when you see Eric? Dr. Meyer asked. Ella frowned, her small hands gripping the armrests of the chair. I feel nothing, she said after a moment. It's like he's a stranger who's trying too hard to be nice. Dr. Meyer nodded. That's okay, Ella. You're allowed to feel that way. Is there anything about the visits that you do like? Ella shook her head. Not really. I just want them to stop. Dr. Meyer glanced at me, her expression serious. Ella's feelings are valid, but the court order makes this tricky. If she's truly uncomfortable, we might be able to petition for a change. It will take time, though. I'll do whatever it takes, I said. As long as it's what Ella wants. The petition process was slow and emotionally draining. Eric, predictably, fought back, claiming that the visits were essential for building a bond with Ella. His lawyer argued that cutting off visitation would harm her long-term understanding of her identity. But Ella's testimony during a private session with the judge was a turning point. When asked how she felt about the visits, she was honest and unwavering. I don't need him in my life, she said. I already have a dad. Her words carried a weight that silenced even Eric's lawyer. The court ultimately ruled in our favor, reducing Eric's visitation rights to a yearly supervised meeting, contingent on Ella's consent. It wasn't perfect, but it was a step toward giving her the autonomy she deserved. When I told Ella the news, she broke into a relieved smile. So I don't have to see him anymore? She asked. Not unless you want to, I said. She threw her arms around me, her laughter filling the room. Thank you, Dad. That night, as I watched her sleep, I felt a profound sense of gratitude. The road had been long and fraught with pain, but we'd made it through together. Ella was my daughter in every way that mattered, and no court, no biology, and no stranger with a legal claim could ever change that. The decision to limit Eric's visitation rights marked the beginning of a new chapter for Ella and me. It wasn't the dramatic end to the battle I'd envisioned, it was quieter, more like the easing of a storm. For the first time in years, life felt like it was our own again. Ella flourished. She poured her energy into school, friends, and soccer, her laughter ringing through the house with a lightness I hadn't heard in a long time. The weight she'd been carrying, of court hearings, therapy sessions, and the uncertainty of her world, seemed to lift. For me, it was a revelation. I could breathe again, no longer haunted by the fear of losing her. We had weathered the storm, and while the scars it left would never fully fade, they were a testament to our resilience. Karen remained a part of Ella's life, though their relationship was still a work in progress. Karen had accepted her place in the new family dynamic, more of a co-parent than a partner, more a visitor than a constant presence. To her credit, she was making an effort. She never missed a soccer game, and her once tense visits with Ella grew warmer as the months went on. "Do you think she'll forgive me someday?" Karen asked me one evening after a game. "She's already on her way," I said honestly. "But it'll take time." Karen nodded, her gaze fixed on Ella as she laughed with her teammates. "I hope so. I don't deserve it, but I hope so." Eric, for his part, faded into the background. The yearly supervised visits were an option Ella never took advantage of, and as time passed, his presence in our lives diminished to a memory. Whether he moved on or simply gave up, I didn't care. Ella had made her choice, and I respected it. One evening, as Ella and I sat on the back porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, she turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "Dad?" she said. "Yeah, kiddo? Do you ever wish things were different? Like none of this ever happened?" Her question caught me off guard, but I considered it carefully. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I wish you didn't have to go through all that. You deserve better." Ella nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "But I think it made us stronger. Like I know who I can count on. And that's you?" Her words hit me like a warm wave, filling me with a pride I couldn't put into words. "Thanks, Ella," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "That means everything to me." She smiled, resting her head on my shoulder. "I love you, Dad." "I love you too," I said, wrapping an arm around her. As the sun set and the first stars began to twinkle in the night sky, I felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Life wasn't perfect. There were still challenges ahead, still moments of doubt and difficulty. But we had each other, and that was enough. Ella was my daughter, my world, and my greatest source of strength. Together, we had built something new from the wreckage of what had been. It wasn't the life I'd imagined, but it was ours. And it was beautiful.